A wooden board piled high with rocks crushed Margaret Clitherow's chest, the sickening crack of her ribs serving as a brutal warning from a dynasty hungry for total control. The Tudor state refused to let anyone live outside their grip, using raw physical force to literally pulverize the stubborn remnants of the old feudal world that dared to defy the king. Her broken body stands as the rawest image of the violent collision between a new state power demanding submission and the old values refusing to break. She chose to lie on a sharp stone, enduring the horrific weight grinding down on every muscle, just to keep the crown's greedy hands off her children's inheritance. That 15-minute death was a lopsided battle, a small butcher's wife standing against a massive government machine, trying to swallow everything in its path. Let's step into that dark cell to witness the cruelty of a rising empire, determined to flatten anyone who stands in its way. History often remembers the reign of Queen Elizabeth I through a lens of golden nostalgia. We think of Shakespeare premiering plays at the Globe. We think of Sir Francis Drake circumnavigating the world. We think of pearls, ruffs, and the defeat of the Spanish Armada. We call it Merry England. But for a vast segment of the population, specifically the conservative traditional families of northern England, this was no golden age, it was a police state. By the 1570s, the English Reformation started by Henry VIII had curdled into a bitter, paranoid standoff. What began as a king's desire for a divorce had morphed into a total restructuring of society. The old monasteries, which had served as hospitals, welfare centers, and spiritual anchors for centuries, were ruins, their stone skeletons dotting the Yorkshire landscape like open wounds. The Latin Mass, the rhythm of life for generations, was illegal. The geopolitical stakes were existential. In 1570, Pope Pius V had issued the papal bull Regnans in Excelsis. It was a document that changed everything for English Catholics. In it, the Pope didn't just excommunicate Elizabeth I. He formally deposed her and absolved her Catholic subjects of their allegiance to her. In plain English, the Pope told English Catholics that killing the Queen was no longer a sin. It was a potential duty. The reaction in London was immediate and ferocious. The government of Elizabeth I, led by the astute and ruthless spymaster Sir Francis Walsingham, stopped viewing Catholicism as a theological error. They began viewing it as high treason. Every Catholic was now a potential fifth columnist, a sleeper agent waiting for the signal to rise up and welcome a Spanish invasion. Laws were passed that turned the practice of the old faith into a financial and physical crime. To simply miss Sunday service at the Anglican Church made you a recusant, a refuser. The fines for recusancy were ruinous, designed to bankrupt wealthy families and crush the poor. But the true capital offense was the priesthood. The Act of 1584 against Jesuits and seminary priests was the turning point. It declared that any Catholic priest ordained abroad who set foot in England was automatically guilty of high treason, a crime punishable by being hanged, drawn, and quartered. But the law went further. It extended the death penalty to anyone who aided, comforted, or harbored such a priest. Giving a priest a meal was a capital crime. Hiding him in your attic was a death sentence. This was the atmosphere in which Margaret lived. It wasn't a world of open debate. It was a world of whispers, of servants paid to listen at keyholes, of neighbors incentivized to report neighbors. It was a world where a misplaced rosary bead or a Latin prayer book found in a drawer could lead to the destruction of an entire family. No city in England felt this tension more acutely than York. York was the capital of the North, a city with a fierce, independent soul. It was a place of narrow, winding streets and towering medieval walls that trapped the smells and the secrets of its inhabitants. It was deeply conservative. While London might have embraced the new Protestant trends, York stubbornly held on to the memory of the past. The people here remembered the pilgrimage of grace in 1536, when their fathers and grandfathers had marched to defend the monasteries, only to be slaughtered by the crown. The crown knew York was a problem. To control this rebellious region, they established the Council of the North, a governing body with sweeping powers to hunt down dissidents. In 1572, the Queen appointed Henry Hastings, the third Earl of Huntingdon, as the president of the council. Huntingdon is a crucial antagonist in our story. He was a committed Puritan, a man who viewed Catholicism not just as treason, but as idolatry, a spiritual filth that needed to be scrubbed from the land. He set up his headquarters in the King's Manor in York and established a surveillance network that would rival the KGB or the Stasi in its efficiency. He utilized a network of pursuivants, professional priest hunters. These were men who roamed the streets of York, empowered to break down doors, rip up floorboards, and interrogate children. They were paid by the arrest. They were hungry, corrupt, and terrifyingly effective. Under Huntingdon's watch, the prisons of York, the castle, and the Kidcote on Euse Bridge began to fill. The heads of executed priests were spiked on the city gates, their features picked clean by birds, serving as grim sentinels over the daily market bustle. Margaret Middleton was born into the very heart of this brewing storm in 1556. Her origins were not aristocratic. She was not a lady of the court playing at religion in a country manor. She was a daughter of the city, born to the solid, industrious middle class that kept York running. Her father, Thomas Middleton, was a wax chandler. In a time before electricity, a wax chandler was a vital profession, providing light for homes, churches, and civic buildings. He was a man of substance, respected enough to serve as the sheriff of York. Margaret grew up in a world of commerce and practicality. She would have been familiar with the sharp smells of tallow and beeswax, the noise of the market, the haggling of merchants. She was described by contemporaries as bright, witty, and possessed of a singular charm. She was attractive, with a quick smile and a spirit that drew people to her. However, tragedy struck early. Her father died when she was young, and her mother, a woman of considerable ambition and steel, remarried quickly. Her new husband was Henry May, a man even more prominent than her first. Henry May would go on to become the Lord Mayor of York. Margaret was not an outsider. She was the stepdaughter of the Lord Mayor. She was true York royalty, embedded in the establishment. She grew up attending the civic dinners, wearing the fine clothes of a merchant's daughter, and walking with the confidence of someone who knows they belong. In 1571, at the tender age of 15, Margaret was married. Her husband was John Clitherow. The match was a sensible, prosperous union of two important trading families. John was a butcher, a wealthy tradesman whose business operated out of the Shambles. If you visit York today, the Shambles is a picturesque tourist attraction, often cited as the inspiration for Harry Potter's Diagon Alley. The timber frame buildings lean toward each other so closely that the roofs almost touch, blotting out the sky. But in 1571, this was not a place of magic shops and cafes. It was a place of slaughter. The word shambles comes from the shelves on which meat was displayed. The street ran with blood and offal. The gutters were often clogged with the refuse of the slaughterhouse. The smell would have been overpowering, a mix of raw meat, sawdust, and unwashed bodies. It was a loud, chaotic, visceral place. This was Margaret's new domain. She became the mistress of the Clitherow household, managing the apprentices, overseeing the domestic accounts, and raising the children that soon followed. John Clitherow was a good man by the standards of his time. He was older than Margaret, steady and hard-working. Crucially, regarding the great question of the age, John was a pragmatist. He was not a fanatic. He was what the records call conformable. He attended the Anglican services as the law required. He wanted no trouble. He wanted to sell his beef, raise his family, and enjoy his standing in the Butchers' Guild. He loved his young, vibrant wife. He indulged her. For the first few years of their marriage, life was normal. Margaret was a Protestant. Like her husband, she attended the services. She played the role of the dutiful, conformable wife. They had children, Henry, William, and Anne. They were on a trajectory to become the pillars of York society, safe, wealthy, and respected. But beneath the surface of Margaret Clitherow, something was shifting. The Pearl of York was beginning to form, layer by layer, created by the friction of her conscience against the world around her. Around 1574, 3 years into her marriage, Margaret experienced a profound spiritual crisis. The details are lost to history. We don't know if it was a specific sermon, a conversation with a neighbor, or the witnessing of an execution. But the result was absolute. She converted to Catholicism. This was not a private decision. In Elizabethan York, there was no such thing as a private religious decision. By stopping her attendance at the Anglican Church, she was declaring war on the state. She was placing a target on the door of the house in the shambles. John Clitherow was suddenly placed in an agonizing position. He was a man trying to maintain his respectability, yet his wife was now a recusant. The fines began to roll in, 12 pence for every missed Sunday. Later, the fines would escalate to £20 a month, a fortune that could ruin a tradesman. We must imagine the dinner table conversations in the Clitherow house during these years, the tension. John pleading with her to just show her face at church just once to get the sheriff off their backs. Margaret smiling but immovable, refusing to compromise her soul for his comfort. And yet John paid. He paid the fines. He argued with the counselors. He used his connections to shield her. He complained about her stubbornness to his drinking companions, calling her foolish. But he never abandoned her. He loved her too much to turn her in, even as her behavior began to rot the foundations of his safe life. But Margaret was not content with merely being a passive recusant. She had tasted the forbidden fruit of the old faith, and she wanted more. She looked at her home, that busy, chaotic house on the shambles, with its coming and going of customers, servants, and apprentices, and she saw something else. She saw a fortress. She saw a sanctuary. While John was busy at the slaughterhouse or meeting with the guild, Margaret began to make modifications to the architecture of their home. She hired trusted carpenters, swearing them to silence. She looked at the thick medieval walls, the spaces between the floorboards, the dark corners of the attic. She began to build a priest hole. The psychological transformation was complete. The wax chandler's daughter was gone. The butcher's wife was gone. In their place stood a soldier of the underground, ready to wage a secret war against the Queen's men. And she was going to do it all, while rocking a cradle and serving her husband his dinner. The game of cat and mouse had begun. By the late 1570s, the house on the shambles had become a split reality, a physical manifestation of the schism tearing England apart. To the casual observer walking down the cobbled street, Number 10 was just a busy, respectable butcher's shop. It was the epitome of lawful, industrious English life. But climb the narrow, creaking stairs, past the domestic quarters where John Clitherow slept, and you entered a different world. Margaret had turned the upper levels and the hidden recesses of the house into a covert operations center for the Catholic underground. This was not a passive act of prayer. It was an act of high-stakes logistical engineering. In Elizabethan England, a priest hole was not merely a closet. It was a life support system designed for invisibility. We do not know the exact schematics of the hiding place Margaret commissioned. Likely built by trusted Catholic craftsmen under the cover of night, but we know the standard of the time. These spaces were often located behind false chimney breasts, under staircases, or between the floorboards of an attic and the ceiling of the room below. They were cramped, airless coffins where a grown man might have to curl up in the fetal position for days at a time, holding his breath while soldiers poked pikes through the plaster walls, inches from his face. Margaret maintained two separate spaces. One was a church located in a rented house nearby, where larger masses could be held for the recusant community. But the heart of the operation was her own home. Here she kept the church stuff, the vestments, the silver chalices, the altar stones, and the Latin missals. These objects were radioactive. To be found in possession of a Catholic vestment was proof of harboring a priest, a crime that carried the death penalty. Yet, Margaret treated these dangerous items with a reckless reverence. She washed the linens herself. She polished the silver. She stored them not in a damp cellar but in a secret cupboard, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. The psychological burden of this double life is difficult to overstate. Every knock at the door could be a customer wanting a leg of lamb or a pursuivant with a warrant. Every glance from a neighbor could be a friendly greeting or a calculation of a reward. Margaret lived in a state of perpetual high-wire adrenaline. Who were the men she was risking her life to hide? They were the seminary priests. These were young Englishmen who had fled to the continent, to seminaries in Douai, France, or Rome, to be ordained. They were trained not just in theology, but in the art of subterfuge. They returned to England in disguise as merchants, soldiers, or courtiers, with a single mission: to keep the Catholic faith alive by administering the sacraments to a starving flock. Margaret's house became the central hub for the mission in the north. Her confessor and spiritual director was John Mush. Mush is a vital figure in history because he wrote the primary account of her life. He was a man of intellect and fire who saw in Margaret a spiritual strength that far exceeded his own. Another frequent guest was Francis Ingleby. Ingleby was the son of a prominent Yorkshire gentry family. He was a local boy, known to the city, which made his presence even more dangerous. He was ordained in 1584 and returned to York to serve the mission. Margaret looked upon these men not just as spiritual fathers, but almost as sons. She fed them, clothed them, and provided them with the one thing the state tried to deny them: a home. She called them my children. In a letter or conversation recorded by Mush, she famously said, "I will not be afraid to serve God and to help his priests, though I should die 1,000 deaths for it." She went further than just harboring priests. She established a secret school. She hired a Catholic schoolmaster, a Mr. Stapleton, to educate her children and the children of other recusant neighbors. In a room in her house, while pigs were butchered downstairs, children were taught the Latin catechism and the tenets of the forbidden faith. She was effectively running a counter-cultural institution, a church and a school, right under the nose of the Protestant authorities. And, perhaps most astoundingly, right under the nose of her husband. Did John Clitherow know? Historians debate this. It seems impossible that he could be entirely ignorant of the strange men coming and going, or the school operating in his own house. It is more likely that John practiced a form of willful blindness. He knew his wife was stubborn. He knew she was devout. He likely told himself, "What I don't see, I can't be blamed for." He would spend his evenings at the tavern, leaving the house to Margaret, perhaps hoping that if he stayed away enough, he could plausibly deny everything when the inevitable hammer fell. He was a man walking a tightrope, balancing his love for his wife against his fear of the Earl of Huntingdon. The tension in York ratcheted up in the early 1580s. The Earl of Huntingdon was under pressure from London to show results. The Queen's spymaster, Walsingham, was uncovering plots involving Mary, Queen of Scots, and paranoia about a Spanish invasion was reaching a fever pitch. Huntingdon needed examples. He needed to strike terror into the Catholic gentry. Margaret, seemingly indifferent to the tightening noose, made a decision that would ultimately doom her. She decided that the secret school in York was not enough for her eldest son, Henry. She wanted him to have a true Catholic education. She wanted him to become a priest. In a move of staggering audacity, she arranged for young Henry to be smuggled out of England and sent to the seminary in Reims, France. Sending a child abroad for Catholic education was a specific statutory offense, but more than that, it was a signal flare. The authorities kept close watch on the children of known recusants. When Henry Clitherow vanished from the streets of York, the Council of the North noticed. They asked questions. Where is the butcher's boy? Why is he not at school? Why has he not been seen? The absence of the son was the smoking gun. It confirmed that the Clitherow household was not just passively Catholic, but actively engaged in the international popish plot. Huntingdon waited. He didn't strike immediately. He waited for the perfect moment to catch the family vulnerable. He waited for a day when the protector, John Clitherow, would be absent. The trap was sprung on Thursday, March 10, 1586. The Sheriff of York summoned John Clitherow to appear before the Council of the North at the King's Manor. The summons was official and imperative. John likely assumed it was about his own recusancy fines, or perhaps a query about his son's whereabouts. He put on his coat, left the shop in the shambles, and walked across the city to answer the call. The moment he was gone, the sheriff enacted the second part of the plan. A raiding party was assembled. It consisted of the sheriff, several aldermen, and a retinue of armed men. They marched to the shambles. Inside the house, it was a typical morning. Margaret was attending to her duties. Mr. Stapleton was teaching the children in the schoolroom. It is believed that a priest, possibly Francis Ingleby, was either in the house or had just departed. The sound of boots on the cobblestones, the shouting of orders, the heavy pounding on the door. Margaret did not panic. Her training had prepared her for this moment. The drill was executed with military precision. The schoolmaster, Mr. Stapleton, was alerted. He scrambled out of a back window or through a secret passage into the neighboring yard, vanishing into the labyrinth of York's alleyways. If a priest was present, he was hurried into the priest hole. The hiding place was sealed. A piece of furniture or a tapestry was moved to cover the entrance. When the soldiers burst through the door, swords drawn, they found Margaret calm. She stood in the center of her home, surrounded by her children and servants. There was no priest. There was no mass being celebrated. The sheriff was frustrated. He knew they were there. He ordered the house torn apart. Soldiers rampaged through the rooms. They thrust their swords into tapestries. They sounded the walls with hammers, listening for the hollow echo that would reveal a cavity. They ripped up floorboards. They opened trunks and overturned beds. Nothing. The priest hole held. The secret architecture of the house was doing its job. Margaret watched them, her face a mask of polite defiance. It seemed, for a brief, hopeful hour, that she had won. The sheriff would have to leave empty-handed, perhaps issuing a fine, but lacking the capital evidence needed for a treason trial. But the sheriff was a cruel and clever man. He realized that physical searches were failing. He needed human intelligence. He looked around the room and saw the children. He saw the servants. He saw a weak link. Accounts vary on who the boy was. Some chronicles identify him as a Flemish boy, a servant, or an apprentice living in the household. Others suggest he was a young student attending the secret school. What matters is that he was a child, likely no older than 10 or 12, terrified by the presence of armed men. The sheriff ordered the boy separated from the household. He was dragged away, perhaps to the cellar or a separate room. The interrogation was brutal in its simplicity. They didn't need waterboards or racks for a child. They stripped him to his shirt. They produced a rod, a birch cane. They threatened to beat him until the skin was flayed from his back. The boy wept. He was alone, surrounded by shouting men threatening him with pain. Then, the sheriff changed tactics. He offered the carrot. He told the boy that if he showed them the secret place, he would not be beaten. He would be given money. He would be given sweetmeats. He would be a hero of the queen. The combination of terror and bribery broke the child's will. Sobbing, he nodded. He led the soldiers back upstairs. He pointed a trembling finger at a specific innocent-looking section of wainscoting that the soldiers had already passed by twice. "There," he whispered. "The priest stuff is there." The soldiers smashed through the paneling. They didn't find a priest. He had likely escaped or was in a different, deeper hole that remained undiscovered. John Mush survived, implying he wasn't found. But they found something just as deadly. They pulled out the vestments, the albs, the chasubles embroidered with crosses. They found the chalices. They found the books. In the eyes of the law, these inanimate objects were as damning as a living man. These were the implements of treason. By possessing them, Margaret was proving that she harbored priests, that she facilitated the mass, that she was an enemy of the state. The sheriff emerged from the room, holding the vestments like a trophy hunter holding a pelt. He looked at Margaret. The game was over. The discovery of the vestments marked the end of Margaret's double life and the beginning of her martyrdom. The sheriff had won the physical raid, stripping the house of its secrets and dragging its mistress into the light. But as the heavy doors of York Castle slammed shut behind her, the conflict shifted from a game of hide-and-seek to a cerebral battle of wills. Margaret was no longer just a suspect. She was a defendant facing a legal system designed to crush her. Yet, she entered the Guildhall not as a victim, but as a strategist ready to exploit the one flaw in the English law that could save her family. Margaret was arrested on the spot. She was not allowed to say goodbye to John, who was still being detained at the King's Manor, unaware that his home had been raided and his life destroyed. She was marched through the streets of York. The neighbors, the people she had bought bread from, the people who had nodded to her in the street, watched from their windows. Some jeered, some wept. Most simply watched in fearful silence. She was taken to York Castle. The conditions were horrific. The cells were damp, freezing, and infested with rats and lice. Disease was rampant. But Margaret had been here before. She knew the darkness of the cell. This time, however, was different. This wasn't a short stint for recusancy. This was a capital charge. John Clitherow returned home to find his house ransacked, his servants weeping, his wife gone, and his children traumatized. The church stuff was gone. The sheriff had left a seal on the door. John realized instantly the magnitude of the disaster. He was not just a husband missing a wife. He was a man whose entire estate was now subject to forfeiture. If Margaret was convicted of treason, everything he owned, the shop, the house, the inheritance for his children, belonged to the Queen. 4 days later, on Monday, March 14th, 1586, Margaret Clitherow was brought to the Guildhall for her arraignment. The Guildhall in York is a magnificent medieval structure with a grand oak roof. Margaret listened, her face pale but composed. She answered them with a theological sharpness that stunned the room. "I die for the love of God and His truth," she said. "I will not betray my children." Then the judges played their trump card. They summoned her family. We must picture the scene. The doors of the Guildhall opened, and in walked Henry May, the future Lord Mayor of York, a man of immense dignity and power. He was Margaret's stepfather. He had raised her. He was a Protestant, a pillar of the establishment, a man who had tried to keep the family safe and respectable. To see his stepdaughter in the dock, facing such a grotesque death, broke him. Accounts say he fell to his knees in the middle of the court. He wept openly. He begged her, "Margaret, for the love of Christ, plead. Do not throw your life away. Think of your husband. Think of your little ones." The gallery watched in hushed silence. This was the raw human drama of the Civil War that religion had unleashed on England. A father begging a daughter to compromise just enough to survive. Margaret looked at him. One can only imagine the agony in her heart. She loved him, but she knew that pleading meant trial, and trial meant calling her children to testify. She saw the trap the judges had laid. They wanted to use her family's love to break her resolve. She shook her head gently. "I cannot," she said. "I will not be tried by the country." She was trading her life for her children's innocence. It was an act of maternal protection so fierce it looked like madness to the men in the room. As the pressure mounted and the judges prepared to pass the fatal sentence, Margaret dropped a bombshell that sent a shockwave through the Guildhall. "I'm with child," she said. The courtroom erupted. Under English common law, it was illegal to execute a pregnant woman. The life of the unborn child was considered innocent, regardless of the mother's crimes. If she was pregnant, the execution had to be stayed until the baby was born. This would buy her months. In those months, the political winds might change, a pardon might come, she might survive. Judge Clinch hesitated. This changed everything. He could not order the death of an unborn infant. He ordered a jury of matrons. This was a peculiar and invasive legal procedure. 12 respectable women from the city, neighbors, matrons, midwives, were sworn in on the spot. They were not there to judge the crime. They were there to judge the body. Margaret was taken out of the courtroom into a private chamber. The 12 women followed. The door was shut. What happened in that room was a humiliating physical examination. Margaret was stripped. The women probed her abdomen looking for the signs of life, the swelling of the womb, the movement of a fetus. It was a violation of privacy that would be traumatizing for any woman, let alone one facing death. Margaret endured it with her characteristic stoicism. She knew she was pregnant. She felt the changes in her body. But when the women emerged from the chamber and returned to the courtroom, they were confused. They whispered among themselves. They could not agree. Some said yes, she was with child. Others said they couldn't be sure. It was too early to tell. They delivered a split verdict to the judge when we know not. This was the moment where the judicial system failed completely. In a case of doubt, mercy should have prevailed. But the authorities were tired. They were frustrated by this stubborn woman who had turned their court into a circus for days. They wanted it over. Judge Clinch looked at the uncertain women. Then he looked at Margaret. "She is not with child," he ruled. He chose to ignore the possibility. He chose to take the risk of killing an infant rather than delay the sentence. Margaret's voice rang out clear and desperate, not for herself but for the life inside her. "I am as with child as any woman here." It didn't matter. The state had decided to close its ears. The Pearl of York was to be crushed, and if a pearl grew within her, it would be crushed too. The room quieted. The shuffling of feet stopped. Judge Clinch put on the black cap, or its Elizabethan equivalent, and pronounced the judgment. It is one of the most chilling sentences ever recorded in the annals of British law. He did not sentence her to hang. He recited the formula for peine forte et dure. You must return from whence you came, and there, in the lowest part of the prison, be stripped naked, laid down, your back upon the ground, and as much weight laid upon you as you are able to bear, and more, and so to continue until you be dead, and more. The cruelty of those two words. The law mandated that the weight must exceed the body's capacity to survive. Margaret did not scream. She did not faint. She lifted her eyes to the bench and spoke words that would be repeated by Catholics throughout Europe for centuries. God be thanked. I am not worthy of so good a death as this. Meanwhile, across the city, the news reached John Clitherow. He was still detained, pacing the floors of the King's Manor. A messenger arrived and told him the verdict. She is condemned to the press. The reaction of John Clitherow is a detail so visceral, so medically specific, that it anchors this story in reality. Accounts say he wept so vehemently that blood gushed out of his nose. It was a physical manifestation of a broken heart. The stress, the blood pressure spiking, the sheer horror of imagining his wife, the mother of his children, the woman he had shared a bed with for 15 years, being flattened under stones. Let them take all I have, he sobbed, and save her, for she is the best wife in all England and the best Catholic also. It was too late. The machine was in motion. The sentence of peine forte et dure had been passed, and the legal stalemate was broken by the promise of brute force. There was no going back. The judges had washed their hands of the matter, and the husband's pleas had fallen on deaf ears. As the final hours of Good Friday approached, the theoretical horror of the law was about to become a visceral reality. Margaret left the courtroom not for a cell of indefinite detention, but for a small, damp room on the bridge where the abstract concept of pressing would be translated into the terrifying weight of stone. Margaret was taken back to York Castle. She was placed in a condemned cell. The date for the execution was set for Friday, March 25th, 1586. The symbolism was overwhelming. It was Good Friday, the day of Christ's crucifixion, but it was also the Feast of the Annunciation, Lady Day, the day the angel Gabriel appeared to the Virgin Mary. For a Catholic mystic like Margaret, to die on this specific double holy day was a sign of divine favor. It was a perfect day to die. She spent her final night not in terror but in preparation. The psychology of the martyr is complex. Where most would be paralyzed by fear, Margaret entered a state of hyperfocus. She was preparing for her wedding day, her marriage to God. She sat in the dim light of the cell and took up a needle and thread. She had some linen cloth. She began to sew. She was sewing her own shroud. But it wasn't just a shroud. She was sewing a habit, a long, loose white garment. She knew the sentence. Stripped naked. The thought of being exposed, nude, before the eyes of the executioners and the crowd was the one thing that terrified her modest sensibilities. She was determined to die with dignity. She sewed strings onto the garment so she could tie it around her ankles and wrists, ensuring that even in the throes of death, her body would remain covered. It was a final act of control. They could take her life, but she would not let them take her modesty. The jailers watched her. Some were moved to tears. The grim men who guarded the dungeons of York had seen many things, but a woman calmly sewing her own death gown while humming psalms was something new. She prayed through the night. She reportedly knelt on the cold stones for hours, entering a trance-like state. She was steeling her mind against the pain she knew was coming. She was visualizing the passion of Christ, overlaying his suffering onto her own impending torture. Friday morning dawned. March in York is cold. A damp, biting wind usually blows off the River Ouse. The city was awake early. The news had spread. Everyone knew what was happening today. The crowds began to gather, not with the raucous energy of a hanging, but with a somber, morbid curiosity. They lined the streets leading from the castle to Ouse Bridge. At 8 a.m., the sheriff arrived at the cell. Margaret was ready. She had dressed in her ordinary clothes, carrying the white linen habit over her arm. She did not need to be dragged. She walked. She walked out of the castle gates and into the daylight. The route to Ouse Bridge was a short but intense procession. She walked past the very shops where she had bought cloth, past the churches where her neighbors prayed. She dispensed alms to the poor as she walked, giving away the few coins she had left. She smiled at the people in the crowd. Witness accounts, and there were many eyes on her that day, describe her demeanor as cheerful. This cheerfulness is a common trope in hagiography, but in Margaret's case it rings true as a psychological defense mechanism. She had accepted her fate. She had moved beyond fear into a state of dissociative resolve. She was no longer Margaret the butcher's wife. She was Margaret the martyr, playing her part in a divine drama. They reached the Ouse Bridge. The bridge was the commercial and civic heart of the city, lined with shops and buildings. Halfway across stood the toll booth, a small prison, and administrative building. This was the killing floor. The location was strategic. It was public, yet enclosed. It was in the center of the city, yet hidden from the direct view of the masses. The execution would happen inside the lower room of the toll booth, but the knowledge of it would radiate outward to every corner of York. Margaret stepped into the room. It was cold. The floor was dirt and stone. In the center of the room, the equipment was waiting. A heavy wooden door taken from its hinges. A pile of large, sharp stones gathered from the roadside, and 4 beggars. The sheriff had hired 4 local beggars to perform the execution. It was a common practice to pay the desperate to do the dirty work that the official hangman might balk at. These men were standing by, ready to heave the rocks. Margaret looked at the apparatus of her death. She looked at the door that would crush her. She looked at the sharp stone, the fist-sized rock, positioned on the floor where her back would rest. She turned to the sheriff. "I am ready," she said. The room inside the toll booth was dim, smelling of damp stone and the river water that rushed beneath the bridge. It was a space designed for bureaucracy, for collecting tolls and holding drunks. But now it had been repurposed into a theater of calculated cruelty. Margaret stood in the center of the room. The sheriff turned to her and commanded her to strip. For a Victorian or modern sensibilities, this command is shocking. For an Elizabethan woman of Margaret's standing, it was a violence almost equal to the death itself. Modesty was a fortress. To be naked was to be shamed, to be reduced to animal status. It was the state's final attempt to break her psychological armor before they broke her bones. Margaret did not fight, but she did not rush. She asked the women present. A few female attendants had been allowed in to stand around her, forming a human screen to shield her body from the gaze of the men. Behind this wall of skirts, she removed her gown, her petticoats, and her shoes. She put on the linen habit she had sewn the night before. It was a simple, shapeless white shift. With steady hands, she tied the tape she had stitched onto the hem around her ankles and wrists. She was binding herself, ensuring that when the convulsions of pain came, her legs would not thrash open, and her body would remain covered. Even in the face of annihilation, she maintained agency over her own image. She lay down on the floor. The executioners had prepared the ground with sadistic precision. Directly under the spot where her spine would rest, they had placed a sharp stone, described in the chronicles as the size of a man's fist. This was not accidental. The purpose of the stone was to act as a fulcrum. When the weight was applied from above, the back would be forced to arch over this sharp point, snapping the spine and hastening death. She lay back. The sharp rock pressed into her vertebrae. She stretched out her arms, not bound at her sides, but extended in the shape of a cross. She tied her own hands to the posts driven into the floor. She was now a crucifix of flesh and bone, pinned to the earth of York. The sheriff gave the signal. The beggars he had hired stepped forward. They lifted the heavy wooden door, likely an interior door taken from the prison cells, and lowered it onto her chest. It covered her from her neck to her thighs. Her face remained visible, staring up at the ceiling, or perhaps at the faces of the men about to kill her. Margaret spoke. She told the sheriff, "I die for the love of God and His truth." The sheriff was unmoved. "Do your duty," he told the beggars. The physics of peine dure are terrifyingly simple. It is a war between gravity and the structural integrity of the human ribcage. The beggars began to bring the stones. These were not pebbles. They were heavy limestone rocks and iron weights, some weighing 50 or 60 pounds each. They placed the first stones on the corners of the door to stabilize it. The pressure began. At first, it would have felt like a heavy blanket. Then, as more weight was added, the door began to press down. The air was forced out of her lungs. The ability to inhale became a struggle. Margaret prayed aloud, "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus, have mercy on me." They added more stones. The weight climbed. 100 pounds, 200 pounds, 400 pounds. The door bowed. The sharp rock underneath drove upward. The ribs began to crack. The sound of snapping bone would have been audible in the small stone room. The pain is unimaginable. It is the panic of drowning combined with the agony of being crushed. The lungs cannot inflate against the pressure. The heart struggles to pump. The blood vessels in the face and eyes burst from the pressure. Yet she kept praying. Her voice grew weaker, a raspy whisper forced out of compressed lungs. "Jesus, mercy." The sheriff, perhaps growing impatient, or perhaps wanting to end the spectacle, ordered the final massive weights to be added. The total weight is estimated to have been between 700 and 800 pounds, over 300 kilograms. The pile of stones rose high above her body. The door crushed down. After about 15 minutes of this torture, the whispering stopped. Margaret Clitherow lay still. The Pearl of York had been crushed back into the dust. Silence fell over the toll booth. Margaret was gone, but the cruelty was not over. The authorities, perhaps fearing a miraculous recovery or simply wanting to ensure the job was finished beyond any doubt, refused to remove the press. They left the crushing weight on her corpse for 6 long hours. From 9 a.m. until 3 p.m., the traditional hour of Christ's death, the stones remained piled on the corpse of the butcher's wife. The sheriff and his men stood guard, watching a pile of rocks, terrified of the dead woman beneath them. At 3 p.m., they finally began the work of dismantling the press. They heaved the stones off one by one. They lifted the door. The body was broken, her ribs were shattered, her spine snapped. But her face, according to the accounts, was serene. Now came the question of disposal. They could not give her a Christian burial in a churchyard. She was a traitor and a heretic. They certainly didn't want to give the body to her family, who would treat it as a relic. They waited until nightfall. Under the cover of darkness, the sheriff's men loaded Margaret's body onto a cart. They drove it out of the city gates toward a marshy, foul-smelling area of waste ground. They buried her in a dunghill. It was the final insult. They tried to erase her by burying her in filth, hoping that she would rot anonymously, forgotten by the city she had defied. They underestimated the network Margaret had built. Margaret Clitherow was not just a lone woman, she was the matriarch of an underground army. The priests she had hidden, men like John Mush and Francis Ingleby, were still at large. They had eyes everywhere. They had watchers on the bridge. They had spies who followed the cart that night. The location of the body was noted. 6 weeks later, a covert operation was launched. It was a scene straight out of a spy novel. A group of Catholic men, led by John Mush himself, crept out of the city at night. They navigated the marsh. They located the specific dunghill. They began to dig. They found her. Despite 6 weeks in the earth, accounts claim the body was remarkably preserved, a common claim in hagiography, but in the cool anaerobic mud of a York spring, it is scientifically plausible. They reverently lifted her from the filth. They washed her. They could not take the whole body back to the city. It was too large, too heavy, and too dangerous to transport without detection. They had to make a difficult choice. They reburied her in a secret, consecrated spot, a location known only to a few, a secret they took to their graves. To this day, the final resting place of Margaret Clitherow remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of York. However, they took a relic. They severed her hand. This hand, the hand that had hidden priests, the hand that had sewn the shroud, the hand that had refused to plead, was preserved. It was smuggled out of the country, kept safe in reliquaries, abroad for centuries, before finally returning to York. Today it rests in the Bar Convent in York, a shriveled, tangible connection to the events of that Friday in 1586. The shock of Margaret's death reverberated instantly. John Clitherow was released from the king's manor. He was a broken man. He returned to the house on the shambles, now empty of his wife's laughter and energy. He continued to run his business, eventually remarrying, but the shadow of the execution hung over him. The Queen, Elizabeth I, was furious. When news reached London that a woman, a mother, a housewife had been pressed to death in York, Elizabeth reportedly wrote a stinging letter to the Council of the North. She was a master politician. She knew that creating martyrs was bad for business. It made her government look weak and tyrannical. She essentially asked, why did you have to go that far? Why couldn't you just keep her in prison? The sheriff and the council were reprimanded. The use of peine forte et dure became even rarer after this, tainted by the scandal of Margaret's death. But the most profound legacy was found in Margaret's children. The state had killed the mother to stamp out the faith in the family. It backfired spectacularly. John Clitherow's children did not abandon their mother's cause. They were radicalized by it. Anne Clitherow fled the country and became a nun. Henry Clitherow, the boy whose education started the trouble, became a priest. William Clitherow, the younger son, also became a priest. The very thing Margaret had died to protect, her children's souls, in her view, was secured. She had won the game. She had saved their inheritance. John kept his property. And she had secured their spiritual future. For centuries, Margaret Clitherow remained a folk hero to English Catholics, her story whispered in secret masses. It wasn't until 1970 that the Vatican officially recognized her. Pope Paul VI canonized her as one of the 40 martyrs of England and Wales. But stripping away the halo and the title of saint, what remains is a story of terrifying human resilience. Margaret Clitherow was a woman who drew a line in the sand. In a world that demanded total compliance, she engaged in total resistance. She utilized the only weapon she had, her home, her silence, and her body. She proves that the most dangerous opponent to a totalitarian system isn't always the soldier with a sword. Sometimes it is the mother who refuses to be afraid. She turned her domestic sphere, her kitchen, her attic, her sewing room, into a fortress of defiance. She is called the Pearl of York. A pearl is created by irritation, by a grain of sand inside an oyster that is coated over and over until it becomes something hard, beautiful, and unbreakable. Margaret was the grit in the eye of the Elizabethan state. In the end, the stones broke her ribs, but her silence broke the court. And that is why, 400 years later, we still remember the butcher's wife who would not scream.